Welcome back, everyone. You know how we love to take these deep dives, and wow, do we have a powerful one for you today. We're going to be looking at Let It Shine, Stories of Black Women Freedom Fighters. It's by Andrea Davis Pinkney. I think we can both agree that this book is really something special.
Oh, absolutely. It's just so inspiring. It tells the stories of 10 Black women throughout American history, and, it really highlights how they faced so much racial injustice. But, despite all of that, they were just so incredibly courageous and really fought hard for change. It's really moving.
It really is. And what I love about this book is that it doesn't just feel like a dry history lesson. It really brings these women to life. It's like getting these snapshots of their
It
lives.
does. It's like getting these really vivid glimpses into who they were, not just as, these historical figures, but also as like real people.
Exactly. And speaking of light, I mean, the title itself, Let It Shine, is so powerful, right? It really speaks to the courage, the hope, and the determination of these women. Like, even in the face of such darkness, their lights just shone so brightly.
Yeah. And I think what's really interesting is how the book shows how these individual lights, like all these separate stories of courage and activism, how they really contributed to a more just America. Like how each of these women played a role in pushing things forward.
And I think that's a really important point because when we think about the fight for civil rights, it's easy to focus on just a few big names, right? Like, I'm sure everyone listening has heard of Harriet Tubman
Of course.
or Rosa Parks.
Right.
But this book introduces us to some, maybe not new, but lesser known figures like Biddy Mason and Fannie Lou Hamer. And I think learning about these maybe slightly lesser known women is just as important as learning about the really famous ones.
Oh, for sure. I mean, it really gives you a much broader and a more nuanced understanding of, like the whole civil rights movement. It wasn't just a handful of people who made change happen. It was so many people from all walks of life who all played their part.
Exactly. And this book really showcases how these women, both those we know and maybe some we're meeting for the first time, really played a huge role in making America a fairer place, especially for Black people. So, how is the book actually structured? Like, how does it go about telling these stories?
Well, it's really interesting. The book is structured chronologically, so it starts with Sojourner Truth and ends with Shirley Chisholm. And what this does is it really lets you see how the fight for civil rights progressed over time, how things changed and evolved over generations.
It's like watching a timeline unfold, right? Like you see how the earlier women paved the way for the later ones, how their struggles and their achievements laid the groundwork for what came next.
Exactly. And I think that chronological structure really helps to emphasize that, the fight for justice is this ongoing process, this relay race where each generation builds upon the work of the ones that came before them.
It's a great analogy. So let's talk about some of these incredible women, starting with Sojourner Truth, who I have to admit I don't know a ton about. What made her such a significant figure in this fight?
Well, Sojourner Truth was an amazing speaker, and she was incredibly powerful in speaking out against both slavery and the denial of women's rights. Her speeches were like legendary. They were full of wisdom and, raw emotion, and she always brought in her own personal experiences to make her points even more powerful.
So she was really fighting on two fronts then, both for racial equality and for women's rights.
Absolutely. And what was so impactful about her was how she connected those two struggles. Like she showed how they were interconnected. And that was really groundbreaking at the time because often those issues were treated as separate things.
It's so interesting how these themes kind of weave together throughout history, isn't it? So then we have Biddy Mason, who has a very different but just as compelling story. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Yeah. Biddy Mason's story is all about resilience and community. I mean, imagine this. She was born into slavery, and then after gaining her freedom, she became a very successful businesswoman.
That's incredible, especially considering the time period.
Right. And what's really amazing is that she didn't just, hoard her wealth. She really used it to help her community, like supporting other people, investing in their well-being, and even building institutions that would really help uplift Black people.
That's so powerful. It's like she took her own experience and used it to create something positive and lasting for others.
Exactly. And, to think about the huge obstacles she must have faced as a formerly enslaved Black woman trying to build a business back then, it's mind-blowing. Her achievements really speak to her determination and her incredible ingenuity.
Absolutely. Okay, so next up, we have someone everyone's probably heard of, Harriet Tubman. I mean, she's practically synonymous with the Underground Railroad, isn't she?
Oh, absolutely. Harriet Tubman's bravery and her leadership on the Underground Railroad are legendary. I mean, think about it. She was known as the Moses of her people because she risked her own life and her freedom over and over again to guide enslaved people to safety.
I read somewhere that she helped over 300 people escape to freedom.
Yeah, over 300 people. And, it wasn't just about her own courage. It was also about her intelligence and her strategic thinking. She had to build this whole network of safe houses and secret routes, and she had to know the terrain like the back of her hand.
It's just unbelievable. What she accomplished is just incredible.
It really is. And I think her story teaches us so much about, what effective resistance can look like, especially when you're fighting against such a powerful and oppressive system.
Yeah, it's a story that really resonates even today, isn't it?
No?
So moving on, we have Ida B. Wells Barnett, who really took on a horrific injustice head on.
Yeah. Ida B. Wells Barnett was a journalist and an activist, and she was just fearless in her fight against lynching. It's really remarkable how brave she was, especially considering that she was constantly facing threats and even violence because of her work.
It must have taken so much courage to keep going despite those dangers.
It did. And, she didn't just speak out against lynching. She actually meticulously documented these crimes. She was like a detective, gathering evidence and then using that evidence to expose the truth to the world. And this was at a time when, Black voices were often silenced and ignored.
It really highlights the importance of truth-telling and the role that journalism can play in fighting for justice.
It does. And sadly, those themes are still so relevant today.
Absolutely. So we've talked about a few women who focused on direct action and resistance, but then we have someone like Mary McLeod Bethune who made her mark in the field of education.
Yeah. Mary McLeod Bethune really believed in the power of education, especially for Black girls. She knew that education was the key to empowerment and self-determination, and she dedicated her life to creating opportunities for Black students, especially young women.
And she actually founded a school, right?
She did. She founded a school that would eventually become Bethune-Cookman University, which is still operating today. And, to think about the challenges she must have faced in establishing a school for Black students, especially back then, it's just remarkable.
It really speaks to her vision and her commitment to creating a better future for Black communities.
It does. And her impact on the landscape of Black education in America is just immense. She opened doors for countless students who would have otherwise been denied access to education.
Yeah, it's another example of how one person can truly make a difference. So then we have Ella Josephine Baker, who took a slightly different approach to activism, right?
Yeah. Ella Josephine Baker was all about grassroots organizing. She believed that real change comes from the bottom up, from ordinary people coming together and demanding their rights.
So she was more focused on empowering people to take action themselves rather than relying on leaders or institutions.
Exactly. And she was really instrumental in the formation of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which played a huge role in the civil rights movement.
And I think what's interesting about her approach is that it really emphasizes the importance of participation and, like everyone having a voice.
It does. It's this idea that everyone has the power to make a difference, that you don't have to wait for someone else to lead the way. You can take action yourself, and you can inspire others to do the same.
It's a really empowering message. So next we have Dorothy Irene Height, who, wow, she dedicated decades of her life to fighting for Black women.
Yes. Dorothy Irene Height, she was a force to be reckoned with. She served as the president of the National Council of Negro Women for, forever. It was decades and decades, and she really became this central figure in advocating for the rights and the well-being of Black women in America.
So she was fighting for both racial justice and gender equality.
Absolutely. And she was amazing at building coalitions and working with all sorts of different organizations to achieve her goals. And that was really crucial because it allowed her to make progress on multiple fronts, both within the civil rights movement and within the women's rights movement.
It's like she understood that these issues were all interconnected and that real change required a multifaceted approach.
Exactly. And her long-standing leadership and her ability to bring people together really made a huge difference in advancing the cause of equality for Black women.
So moving on to someone who probably needs no introduction, Rosa Parks. I mean, her story is so iconic and so powerful.
Yeah. Rosa Parks and her refusal to give up her seat on that bus in Montgomery, Alabama, it was a true turning point in the civil rights movement. And, it's incredible how this one act of defiance, a seemingly small gesture, sparked such a massive movement.
It's like her courage was contagious, right? Like it inspired others to stand up and say, enough is enough.
It did.
Yeah.
And it really showed the power of nonviolent resistance, of how simply refusing to comply with unjust laws can create real change. And the Montgomery bus boycott that followed her arrest, that was a pivotal moment because it showed that collective action, people coming together and refusing to participate in a system that oppresses them, that can actually work.
It's a reminder that sometimes even the smallest actions can have huge consequences.
Yeah. And it also shows how individual courage, when it happens at the right time and in the right place, can really set off a chain reaction and lead to massive social change.
So next up, we have Fannie Lou Hamer, whose story is just incredible just in terms of her persistence and her unwavering commitment to voting rights.
Fannie Lou Hamer, she was a true fighter. I mean, she faced so much opposition, so much intimidation and violence, but she never gave up on her fight to secure voting rights for Black people, especially in Mississippi where she lived.
And this was in the Jim Crow South, right? A time when voting was incredibly dangerous for Black people.
It was, and she endured so much just for trying to exercise her right to vote. But, despite all that, she never backed down. And she had this amazing ability to inspire people, to rally them to her cause.
I love that quote from her. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. It's just so powerful, like it captures that feeling of exhaustion and frustration, but also this determination to keep fighting.
It does. And her voice, her powerful speeches and her unwavering spirit, they really galvanized the voting rights movement. And her story reminds us how important the right to vote is and how hard people fought to secure that right for everyone.
It's a right that we can't take for granted, that's for sure. So finally, we have Shirley Chisholm, who broke down so many barriers in the world of politics.
Yeah. Shirley Chisholm, she made history as the first Black woman elected to the U.S. Congress. I mean, that was a huge deal. She was shattering racial and gender barriers left and right, and she paved the way for so many other women and people of color to enter politics.
And she didn't stop there, right? Like she even ran for president.
She did. In 1972, she launched this incredibly courageous campaign for president. And even though she didn't win, her candidacy was a powerful statement. It showed that Black women could and should have a seat at the table, that they could aspire to the highest office in the land.
It's a testament to her ambition and her belief that anything is possible.
It is. And, her legacy continues to inspire people today. She showed that you can challenge the status quo, that you can fight for what you believe in, even when the odds are stacked against you.
It's amazing to hear about all these individual achievements, but what I love about this book is that it goes beyond just the facts and figures, It also gives us glimpses into these women's personal lives, their childhoods, their families. Like, it really makes them feel more human and relatable.
Yeah, that's one of the things that makes this book so special. By including those details about their early lives, Pinkney really gives us a sense of who these women were, beyond just their accomplishments. And you start to see how their experiences, their upbringing, the challenges they faced early on, all of that shaped who they became and how they approached the fight for justice.
It's like those early experiences laid the foundation for their later activism, right? Like, it gave them that strength and resilience and that unwavering belief in themselves.
Exactly. And I think those personal details also help us to connect with these women on a more emotional level.
Right.
To see them as real people who had hopes and dreams and fears just like us.
And speaking of connection, I think Andrea Davis Pinkney does such a great job of making these stories come alive, Like, her writing is so engaging and vivid.
Oh, absolutely. She's a master storyteller. And she has this way of weaving together those important historical facts with these really compelling narratives, and it makes the book just so readable and so captivating.
And she uses these really powerful images and metaphors, right? Like you mentioned earlier, those snapshots of their lives, those little glimpses that give us these really vivid pictures of who they were and what they did.
Yeah, the snapshots are so effective. And she also incorporates real quotes from these women, which really brings their voices to life. And she talks about specific events in such detail that you really feel like you're right there with them, experiencing those moments alongside them.
I remember that part about Sojourner Truth's "Ain't I a Woman" speech. The way Pinkney describes it, you can practically hear Sojourner Truth's voice booming through the room, commanding everyone's attention.
Exactly. And there's also that part about Ida B. Wells Barnett and her crusade against lynching. Pinkney really captures the danger she was in and her determination to expose the truth no matter the cost.
And then there's the story of Mary McLeod Bethune and her school. You can really feel her passion and her dedication in the way Pinkney describes her efforts to overcome all those obstacles and make her dream a reality.
And let's not forget Fannie Lou Hamer and her fight for voting rights. You can really sense her strength and her resilience, even in the face of such horrific violence and intimidation.
It's amazing how Pinkney manages to pack so much power and emotion into these short narratives. So, beyond the individual stories, what are some of the bigger themes or ideas that connect all of these women? Like, what are some of the key takeaways from the book?
Well, I think one of the most obvious themes is courage. I mean, all of these women displayed such incredible bravery in the face of overwhelming injustice and cruelty. They never gave up, even when things were incredibly difficult and dangerous.
And they were all fighting for what they believed in, right? Like, they weren't afraid to stand up for their convictions, even when it meant putting themselves at risk.
Exactly. And I think that's another important theme. The power of speaking out, of using your voice to challenge injustice. These women weren't afraid to speak truth to power, to demand their rights, to make their voices heard.
And they did it in so many different ways, right? Through speeches, through writing, through activism, through just refusing to stay silent.
They did. And I think their stories remind us that we all have a voice and that we can use it to make a difference, even if it's just in our own small way.
Absolutely. And I think another important theme is the long and ongoing nature of the fight for civil rights. I mean, this book really highlights the fact that progress isn't linear, that there are setbacks and challenges along the way, and that it takes sustained effort and commitment to achieve real change.
Yeah. And I think that's an important lesson for us today.
Yeah.
Like we can't just assume that things will automatically get better. We have to keep pushing, keep fighting, keep demanding justice.
And it's not just about racial justice either, right? Like, a lot of these women were also fighting for gender equality, for women's rights.
Absolutely. And I think that highlights the interconnectedness of social justice movements, like
Yeah.
how the fight for one group's rights is often tied to the fight for everyone's rights.
Yeah, it's like you can't really separate these issues because they're all part of the same larger struggle for equality and justice.
Exactly. And I think another important takeaway from the book is the importance of faith, of inner strength, of that unwavering determination to keep going, even when things are really tough.
Yeah, like even in the face of incredible adversity, these women never lost hope. They never gave up on their dreams of a better future.
And I think that's something we can all learn from. Like no matter what challenges we're facing, we can draw inspiration from their strength and resilience.
Absolutely. So let's talk a little bit about the author, Andrea Davis Pinkney. I mean, she clearly has a passion for this history and for these stories.
Yeah. And I think that comes through so clearly in her writing. She's not just a historian, she's also a storyteller. And she really brings these women to life in a way that's both informative and engaging.
And she has this amazing ability to connect with young readers, right? Like her books are so accessible and relatable, even though they're dealing with some pretty complex and challenging topics.
They are. And I think that's really important because it allows young people to learn about this history in a way that's not intimidating or overwhelming.
And it also helps them to see themselves in these stories, like to realize that they too can make a difference.
Exactly. And it's not just young people who can benefit from reading Pinkney's books. I think anyone who wants to learn more about this history, about these amazing women, would find her work incredibly inspiring.
Absolutely. So, for our listeners who are feeling inspired and want to delve deeper into this subject, are there any other books or resources that you would recommend?
Oh, there are so many great books out there about the civil rights movement and about Black women's history, but a few that come to mind are Brave, Black, First, 50-plus African-American Women Who Changed the World by Cheryl Hudson. That one profiles a whole bunch of remarkable women, so if you enjoyed Let It Shine, you'll definitely want to check that one out.
And what about books that focus on some of the specific women we talked about today?
Well, for Harriet Tubman, there's a really beautiful book called Before She Was Harriet by Lisa Klein Ransom. And it's really interesting because it takes a different approach to her story. Like it focuses on all the different roles she played throughout her life, not just her time as a conductor on the Underground Railroad.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. And what about Rosa Parks?
For Rosa Parks, there's a really powerful and poetic book called Rosa by Nikki Giovanni. And it's really moving because it captures both the courage of her act and the larger impact it had on the movement.
And for listeners who are interested in the experiences of younger activists, there's The Youngest Marcher, the story of Audrey Faye Hendricks, a young civil rights activist by Cynthia Levinson.
That's a great one. And for those who want to explore the contributions of Black men to the fight for civil rights, Andrea Davis Pinkney herself has written a book called Hand in Hand, 10 Black Men Who Changed America, which I highly recommend.
And for a broader overview of African American history, there's Heart and Soul, the story of America and African Americans by Kadir Nelson.
That's a beautiful book, both visually and in terms of its storytelling. So yeah, there are so many great resources out there for anyone who wants to learn more about this incredibly important and inspiring period in American history.
It's been an absolute pleasure diving into Let It Shine with you today. I think we can both agree that these women were truly remarkable and that their stories deserve to be told and retold.
Absolutely. And I think their legacies continue to inspire us today, to keep fighting for justice, to keep speaking out against inequality, to keep working towards a better future for everyone.
And that powerful image of light, of their lights shining through the darkness, it's such a beautiful metaphor for the impact they had and for the hope they represent.
It is. And I think it's a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope. And that each of us has the power to be a light in the world, to make a difference, no matter how small.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will carry with them?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of speaking out against injustice. These women showed us that silence is not an option, that we have a responsibility to use our voices to challenge what's wrong and to fight for what's right.
And they also showed us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear.
Exactly. And that even when things seem impossible, change is always possible if we're willing to work for it, to fight for it, to never give up hope.
And I think it's also important to remember that the fight for justice is ongoing, that it's not something that happened in the past and is now finished.
It's a constant struggle, and it's up to each of us to carry the torch, to continue the work that these women started.
So as a final thought for our listeners, I want to leave you with this question. What light can you shine in your own life? What injustice do you see in the world that you want to fight against? What change do you want to be a part of?
These women have shown us that even small acts of courage can have a ripple effect, that they can inspire others and lead to real change. So what will your contribution be?
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly inspiring journey. And remember, let your light shine.